Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to my talk, Community++. My name is Jerry Wiltsey, and I'm a senior software developer on the Conan team at JFrog. You can find me on Twitter and GitHub at SolvingJ. While this talk is pre-recorded, I'm available in the live chat during the broadcast to answer questions and continue the discussion afterwards. In this talk, I'll be telling the story about how a pair of open source developers successfully created a very ambitious open source application, and then built a very active community of open source C++ developers around it. From that, they forged a partnership with a commercial company, which helped propel them to even more success, not just with the open source community, but also with the vast community of corporate C and C++ development teams. So here is that pair of developers, Diego Rodriguez Losada and Luis Martinez de Bartolome. Diego was a university professor and robotics researcher for 8 years, and Luis was a full-stack developer for over 13 years before they partnered up and started on the journey which we know today as the Conan project. And for those unfamiliar, allow me to introduce the Conan project. Conan is a package manager for C and C++. It's open source and published with an MIT license. It's multi-platform, meaning it can run on Linux, Windows, Mac OS, and basically anywhere else Python can run. Conan is designed to support any build system and any compiler, so it can compile for any platform. Conan has been stable since its 1.0 release, and it promises not to release breaking changes until version 2.0. Conan is also very active. It has several full-time developers, sponsored by JFrog, as well as a very active community which submits dozens of pull requests each month. Also, our Slack channel has over 1,200 members, and is one of the most active channels in the entire C and C++ community. Finally, the Conan team has created multiple interactive self-paced training courses. These courses are all available completely free, courtesy of JFrog, in their online training platform known as JFrog Academy. If you're interested in learning about Conan, it's the best place to start. So now that you know what Conan is, I can give you some of the history. I'll start with some of the motivations and theory behind the project, and then talk about its first year on GitHub. Next, I'll talk about the partnership with JFrog and how it helped Conan meet their needs and leap forward in several ways. Then I'll talk a bit more generally about the landscape of commercial support in the open source software ecosystem. I'll talk about several general purpose funding options which exist for open source projects to accept from individuals and corporations, but focus in a bit more detail on the case of corporations. With that in mind, I'll then try to share a little personal advice for both maintainers and corporations on how to navigate this landscape. So at the heart of the Conan project was the desire to innovate, which many software developers share. More specifically, I think many of us who start open source projects are trying to create new and novel solutions to some outstanding problem. Usually this implies that we believe we have some unique perspective and that we recognize an opportunity which no one else has seen in quite the same way. So what was that unique perspective which led to Conan? Well, it's of course a combination of more than one realization, but for starters, there's never really been a canonical package manager for C and C++. But that alone is not a unique realization. Every modern C and C++ developer is aware of this fact and suffers from it frequently. Another key realization for Conan was that most of the package managers for other languages follow mostly a common architecture. So here's the high-level architecture for Conan, and as you can see, it adheres to that common architecture for package managers. It features these common concepts of a client and server application, a local repository which is used for local packaging operations, and remote repositories for sharing packages with easy-to-use upload and download capabilities. There's also a central and moderated public repository for open source packages, which is known as Conan Center. All of this is similar in spirit to Maven, NuGet, NPM, PyPI, and others, so it should be familiar to most developers. So an important question with any new or novel solution to an outstanding problem is, why is it still outstanding? In this case, there are a few very good reasons. First, the diversity in existing tools for C and C++ is far higher than other languages. There are dozens of common build systems and dozens of common compilers, and this creates a unique level of complexity. To make matters worse, the binaries created from C and C++ source code have unique compatibility constraints. Typically, the only way to guarantee two binaries can be used together is by compiling them together with the same configuration. This makes the concept of a central repository exceptionally complicated. So, despite these apparent challenges, junior and senior developers agree that dependency management, and specifically the lack of a package manager, is perhaps the biggest challenge facing C and C++ as a community and as a language ecosystem. So if these challenges could be solved, it would seem to be a major innovation indeed. So hopefully now the solution seems obvious. So the Conan team set out to create a package manager for C and C++, despite a long list of challenges. Now, if that seems naive, that's because it is. Compared with most other open source tools and applications that one could create, a package manager has a few unique characteristics. One of which is the exceptional level of importance and impact that the project takes on as it gains traction. In C and C++, the build systems are very delicate and complex, and while the end goal of a package manager is to make builds easier by making dependency management easier, it does represent a new layer of knowledge and complexity, which does make other things harder. Next, a successful package manager is one that becomes used by some significant percentage of developers for their daily development workflows. As this adoption increases, any disturbances or even minor changes to the package manager or the packages themselves in the central repository become scrutinized and more controversial. Breaking a critical package in the central repository, for example, can impact many thousands of developers. So operational management and governance of the central repository becomes a very special job with a very high criticality. If that's not enough, there's another category of users for package managers, which is the private enterprise development teams. A single company can have thousands or even tens of thousands of developers all sharing infrastructure and conventions. Existing solutions for dependency management are therefore deeply entrenched, and they've evolved over decades. So if such organizations can manage the massive undertaking, which is to approve and implement a new package manager, it's likely to take at least a year or possibly several to do so. And then when it's all done, if the organization is stuck, continues to suffer from any problems or new challenges presented by the package manager, they're likely to be stuck with that for several more years before the company will be willing to change that out again. So package managers really are serious business, and the Conan team recognized this very early on. As such, they placed a high priority on long-term survival and the sustainability of the project. In addition to the extreme significance of a package manager in an ecosystem, there's simply a lot of different things to think about all at once. First, there's the project source code, which involves a client and a server with a REST API. And as we know, REST APIs change over time, so the backwards compatibility and evolution of these things is non-trivial. Next, there's the central repository, which aims to contain hundreds or potentially thousands of open source packages. Now, these are extremely difficult and time-consuming to manage, especially in C and C++, and it involves vast amounts of engineering and resource management for the infrastructure. And finally, a package manager is nothing without a community of users, and that doesn't just happen automatically. Significant time must be taken away from development to focus on raising awareness, talking with users, and bringing their feedback into the roadmap through GitHub issues and pull requests. Each of these is a major responsibility on its own, so it's clear that a successful package manager must have a significant amount of human resources to survive long term. So despite that sobering reality we just described, the Conan team was not deterred. Within a year, they had a working application, a functional central repository with a surprising number of contributors. It seems like there was a lot of latent demand in the community waiting for such an opportunity and such a project. So they definitely struck a chord. Which is to say that the Conan team's first year was a wild success for any open source project by any measure. To many people, it was very clear that the project had a bright future. One of the big signs of this bright future was the growing community of contributors. It says a lot when you have a significant number of users spending their free time to take a risk on an unproven beta version of a tool and spend their time providing feedback, fixing their own bugs, and contributing new package recipes to the central repository. As the vast number of novel projects on GitHub has continued to grow over the past decade, it's become much more rare to attract that level of participation so quickly. So particularly in the world of C and C++, where the problems are more complex than any other language, it is very rare. Another thing to realize is that this community success was not at all passive or incidental. The Conan founders invested a lot of time to make themselves and the project visible and accessible to their target audience. This means going out to conferences, engaging people at those conferences, and really listening to their problems. It also involves then following up with them when you get back to your keyboard to implement their ideas and take their discussions to the next level. The Conan team did this, and it was integral to the community growth. By the end of this first year, a few things had become abundantly clear. Conan's success and growth would be very limited if it remained purely a hobby project without full-time committers. Furthermore, it's fairly difficult to have a scalable central repository without a mix of financial and developer resources dedicated to it. Also, with the first iteration of the central repository, anonymous packages were allowed. And this raised a lot of security concerns within the community, and it was clear that native binaries required moderation and governance of the package in the central repository. There was a strong request coming from the OSS and enterprise developers alike that trust in the security and longevity of Conan Center was a major factor for the project as a whole. So finally, as we said before, Conan's initial user community growth was great, and happened to include many enterprise developers who were exploring Conan for use in their private corporate environments. Eventually, developers from very large companies and teams started reaching out and asking for assistance with their specific use cases. Over time, it became clear that there were thousands of these types of companies and codebases, many of which represented thousands and tens of thousands of developers. So while the first target audience of Conan was open source developers, they're relatively easy to reach via GitHub and social media. However, this other audience of enterprise developers is equally important and potentially much bigger, but unfortunately it is largely unreachable through such channels. So this project would definitely need to find another way of reaching their audience. And that's where JFrog came in. The first big need was a paid full-time core development team, and JFrog picked up the tab for that right away. In 2016, JFrog hired both the Conan founders and has added additional headcount for Conan each year since. They also granted the Conan team access to their infrastructure and IT staff, providing advanced hosting and maintenance for multiple services, including the Conan.io website, the new Conan Center UI, and the Conan Center repository backend. And of course, all the CI for all the automated builds of all the packages. JFrog also provided access to its other organizational resources, which has led to an immeasurable benefit to the Conan team and the community. This includes HR, marketing, legal, and others. Since 2016, JFrog has sponsored dozens of C++ developer conferences, meetups, and other events through either direct financial contributions, or purchasing booths, or providing a bunch of giveaway items. Not to mention sending multiple staff and developers to these events to spread the word about Conan. Another major thing that came with the partnership was that JFrog immediately gave the Conan project a boost in trust. JFrog was already widely known throughout many developer communities and ecosystems. Thousands of enterprise companies were users of Artifactory, and millions of developers used Bintray, either directly through their own private repositories or indirectly via JCenter. And speaking of Bintray, it provided a nice model for Conan Center, where Conan users could set up their own dedicated Conan repositories for free, and then share packages straight to Conan Center for inclusion. This model was already in place with JCenter, and so most of the engineering was already done. Finally, speaking again about enterprise companies who were already users of Artifactory, it's no coincidence that those companies are the same types of companies Conan was trying to reach. Many of those companies have huge legacy C and C++ code bases and had been asking JFrog and other vendors for a better solution for dependency management for years. Once Artifactory supported Conan as a repository type for C and C++, JFrog and the Conan teams began to jointly spread the message to thousands of enterprise development teams that there was a new solution and it was supported by Artifactory. So Conan's partnership with JFrog was obviously a no-brainer for a lot of reasons. It really is a rare match between an OSS project and a commercial software company. JFrog had an enterprise-grade platform and reach to its enterprise customers, but there was the gap of the missing package manager in the C and C++ ecosystem, which left many JFrog customers struggling. At the same time, Conan provided a solution which filled that very gap and which could fit into JFrog's existing platform and product. And the Conan team needed the type of exposure JFrog could provide. This type of perfect match does not happen very often, but it's great when it does, so it's good to celebrate these kinds of success stories. But what about everyone else? So there's a lot of open source projects out there where the maintainers are interested in attracting commercial funding, either to enable them to make their part-time project a full-time job, or to grow their team and take it to the next level. Sadly, this level of funding and support is typically hard to come by. There are definitely other companies like JFrog who would be eager to acquire open source projects if it solved some of their big problems, or for example, if the project could somehow translate into a new product or into an existing product line. But in either case, the bar is typically pretty high for the open source project. First, the inherent value or demand has to be there and it has to be obvious to the commercial company. Next, the project maintainers need to exhibit some level of maturity and show that they've invested in the project for the long term. So while lightning does strike, it's not necessarily a realistic future for many OSS projects to try to plan for. In some upcoming slides, I'll talk about some other ways to approach the funding of an OSS project, which is maybe more realistic and more general. One of those is Tidelift's subscription model and its managed catalogs program, but there are others. The good news is that overall, commercial support of OSS projects is on the rise. In general, corporations are using more and more open source software each year. Many are eager to provide some sort of support and assistance to those projects that they know that they depend on directly. It's much better for them if their major dependencies survive and are properly maintained. So compared to the cost of maintaining a replacement project internally, the cost of a typical corporate financial contribution to an open source project is relatively minuscule. Of course, the trade-off is the loss of control, but often this trade-off is something that they're willing to make. Another rising factor is that companies are trying to attract modern developers who are active in the open source ecosystem and thus more familiar with cutting-edge platforms and tools. When corporations are able to advertise that they actively support key open source projects and that they have a progressive attitude towards open source software in general, this can be a significant attractor for top-level talent. So in the ecosystem today, many options exist for OSS projects to seek funding and for corporations to provide that funding. So let's take a look at a few here. The most prominent mechanism in the ecosystem today are donation services, which have really exploded in recent years and are still evolving. Open source projects which accept donations have existed for at least 2 decades, but in the last 8 to 10 years, a bunch of services have sprung up to make this process truly trivial for all parties. This includes Patreon, Open Collective, and GitHub sponsors, as well as others. And these are all having a profound and positive impact on open source software in general. The keys to the success of these services have been their simplicity, where the individual person or company can simply contribute any amount of money, either one time or on a recurring basis, to any individual GitHub project that they choose, or open source project, not necessarily GitHub. In general, the money goes directly to the maintainers, and the maintainers have the freedom to use the money however they see fit. Some of them have reporting guidelines about how that money's spent, but not all. So one well-known alternative way to support open source software is to donate to foundations. There are several popular and successful foundations which have been around for a long time, but there are also a few new ones forming each year with different focuses and different target markets. The great thing about the foundations is that donations typically share their support and their financial contributions in the form of infrastructure resources across many different projects. So if you donate to a foundation, you're probably affecting and benefiting a vast number of projects under that foundation. So they also have a more formal organizational structure, which can provide better visibility into how the funds are used than some of the donation services. So this is likely to be a contributing factor to their longevity. One important thing to note about foundations is that no funding is typically given directly to the maintainers of any source code. This is something that all donors and prospective members of those foundations should definitely be aware of, because it's not necessarily obvious or intuitive. So a third way that open source software can be supported is by purchasing support and other products from an organization whose employees directly contribute to the source code for the projects you use. There are many examples of companies like this who have built entire support businesses around collective expertise of a single application or product. Here I've shown Red Hat, CloudBees, and Nagios, and Sangoma, but there are many more. The most unique element here is that people are putting up money to get something concrete in return. Often that's an SLA for technical or engineering support, which is incredibly valuable. Sometimes it can also include more, such as a download access to a closed source plugin or add-on tools, but not necessarily. In contrast to foundations, this approach typically does result in active development and maintenance of the source code, which is also verifiable by simply looking at the source control logs. So on the other hand, if you want people to know that you're putting money into open source projects through this method, you'll have to advertise yourself, because these companies don't typically list all of their enterprise customers anywhere that you can advertise. So even with all of these funding options for open source software, corporations still face significant challenges when they set out to contribute. It's very common for such companies to have hundreds or thousands of open source dependencies. And within these companies, a few of those dependencies might be fairly well known. However, it's almost always the case that there will be many more indirect dependencies which nobody's really aware of, but nonetheless which play a critical role in the company's applications. So if a company wants to donate money to an open source project, it can be difficult to choose a list of projects which will receive that funding. Which are the most important? Which ones require the most maintenance? Which ones are likely to last the longest? It's a hard problem. Even if you only focus on the short list of well-known dependencies, it can be difficult to decide how much money to allocate to each one. Furthermore, what most open source projects need the most is not one-time donations, but rather recurring donations. Fortunately, it has become more widely understood and accepted that that's the case. However, with all the different services for donating money, and each project typically being a separate entity, the burden of managing and accounting and tracking of all of these multiple recurring donation systems is not free, and it's very easy. It takes accounting staff, legal staff, and other staff within these organizations to manage those income streams, those donation streams. So a relatively new and creative approach to address some of these challenges is Tidelift's subscription service. Tidelift combines a number of the qualities of the other channels described earlier, but solves some of the problems or challenges. First of all, if you enroll in Tidelift's subscription service, you get an SLA. This provides the key element corporations want from the paid support model we discussed earlier. Next, corporations enjoy the reduced administrative burden of sending payments to a single entity and supporting numerous dependencies with it. So this is similar to the simplicity that donating to a foundation provides. The organization only has to write one check, and Tidelift takes care of distributing the funds to all of the different maintainers and all of the administrative burden that goes with that. But crucially, one big distinction from foundations is that Tidelift pays money directly to source code maintainers, and this is a big deal because while the infrastructure that foundations typically provide is very important, the top priority for most donors is knowing that the source code of their dependencies is actively being developed and maintained. And so in this way, Tidelift subscriptions aligns with the spirit of the direct donation approach a little more closely. It's also worth pointing out that with the subscriptions model, Tidelift is taking on all of the burden and challenges of their member organizations. So now they need to solve the problem of which projects receive funds, how much, and so forth. As a result, Tidelift has created a pretty brilliant set of tools to solve these problems in a much more scalable and equitable way than corporations could probably ever do on their own. So finally, Tidelift is continuing to innovate on the problem of matching sources of funding with the people who do the critical work in the ecosystem. So managed catalogs are another new addition in this space. They focus directly on providing SLAs and quality guarantees around the packaging of open source software and the funding those who do that packaging. Sometimes it's the core maintainers, but very often it can be others as well, not directly associated with the source code project. So the packaging process is a distinct but critical step in the overall OSS supply chain. So it's really great to see the Tidelift team recognizing this and trying to build a support structure around it. So in closing, I just wanted to offer a few pieces of advice for anyone looking for it. For maintainers, I strongly suggest you consider becoming a Tidelift lifter under the Tidelift subscription program. At least have a look and see if the project or projects that you work on would be good candidates. However, more importantly, I recommend that maintainers who are seeking funding look into as many options as they can find, and frequently redo that research every 6 months or a year, as the landscape is changing rapidly and will probably continue to do so forever. There's also some more advice I would give, but it depends on the type of project that you work on. For projects which have been around a long time and are fairly mature, and for which the maintainers want to be able to devote more time and get paid for their OSS work, consider setting up a support organization and a billing model. Many organizations who would do contributions would prefer to buy a subscription and pay for an SLA over donating money or going through a foundation. Also, consider enrolling in a foundation. You may qualify for a lot of free infrastructure resources that you're currently paying for out of pocket or simply living without. If you're a new project, setting up a donation service through one of the many platforms mentioned earlier is probably the best way to start. It's got very few strings attached, and it can help you measure your success and demand for your project over time. Also, it can be very helpful to pay special attention to backwards compatibility and honor the conventions of semantic versioning. Many people will dismiss projects which don't mention any priority on stability and don't adhere to proper versioning. So if you're regularly making changes that are breaking changes on the master branch, it's probably a big turnoff for corporate donations. On the other hand, if you work for a corporation which is currently creating or evolving its strategy around open source software and are thinking about how to start with funding, consider this. No one strategy is best or probably sufficient. If you have critical infrastructure which depends on open source software, and there's a dedicated support company which can provide you an SLA and developer level support for that software, it's almost worth it to buy the support, almost always. It can reduce the overall risk to your company in the short term, and it supports the maintainers of the project in the long term. Also, if you have a budget for open source software donations, investigate the realm of foundations and choose one or two to donate to. Altogether, these foundations provide infrastructure to hundreds of open source projects, but more than that, many of them focus on other things like evolution and protection of the ecosystem at large, and many of them also do research and create documents and proposals for different governments around the world. And they help these governments stay informed as those governments shape critical policies related to software, intellectual property, and things like the internet. So finally, investigate Tidelift's subscription and managed catalog services. You may find them to be a good fit, and they're definitely devoting a lot of resources and engineering to finding new and healthy ways to sustain this ecosystem. Many developers, including myself, really hope to see these programs succeed, even if we're not necessarily lifters ourselves yet. If you're overwhelmed by all these options, consider putting a small amount of funding into each of these strategies and see how they work for your organization. Then, over time, devote more resources to the ones that work best for you. In the end, there's no simple or correct answer for how corporations should fund the open source software ecosystem, but if you're here and you're involved in the ecosystem, it's probably a sign you're on the right track. In closing, I want to thank you all for your attention today, and thank Tidelift especially for organizing this conference and shedding a new spotlight on a very important topic. I will now be available in the chat for questions.